Yeah, cool. Thank you, Julie. And yeah, I'm glad you saw that Tara was in. I was going to introduce her myself, but Tara is one of our connectors for those of you that don't know much about EGL. She works with our young people with EGL referrals and with budgets and helps them make their good life plans and things like that. So she's just here to help answer any of those questions that is perhaps outside of my knowledge base as well, and to have that extra connector input. So I'll begin. So yeah, we're here to talk about EGL personal budgets. And so ultimately what that is it is a budget that you receive from the Ministry of Health. However, there's also, as you can see in the current slide, some other aspects that can come into that. So it's allocated from an organisation called Lifelinks, in case you're not familiar with them. So they are our local region's needs assessment and service coordinator. They do an assessment of what your current needs are and what might be an appropriate level of funding to service you, to have supports that you might need. We work in conjunction with them to establish your good life plan. That's where Tara and the other connectors can come in. And they help you to find ways to put your funding to use, to help you come up with ideas of what might be ways that you can work towards your goals and things like that. So an EGL personal budget is potentially different from what you might have been used to if you haven't been with EGL long or aren't familiar with EGL, in that it's sort of a collection of the different streams of funding that you might receive. The image that you can see at the moment is just sort of give you an idea. You know, there are or have been multiple different ways that you can, or types of funding that you could receive from the Ministry of Health alone. A couple of those options that you'll see there is the individualized funding, which is a more, I say more recent, but that's several years now, than a very older traditional type of funding allocation model of being purely based on hours of support needs. Whereas now it's more to do with a dollar amount in a budget, which is what an EGL personal budget is. Similar to individualized funding, but it's not got different buckets, so to speak, or different purposes that you are supposed to or meant to use them for. You can use them for any purpose that is a disability support need that fits your needs. And so all of those other Ministry of Health funding streams, the supported living, the carer support, the personal care, home support, household management, any of those words that you may have heard before as being a type of support funding that you're receiving, all of those convert and become part of your EGL personal budget. So there you'll see a list of those. It's probably not exhaustive. There may be one or two that are missing out of there, but those are the ones that you would most likely have seen if you had a budget of some kind before, and before working with Enabling Good Lives. You will note at the bottom there says there's an exception to any of those going into an EGL personal budget, and that is residential support subsidy funding. Without going into too much detail about that, part of the reason for that is those residential contracts are bundled with both disability support funding as well as Ministry of Social Development benefit funding. So there's an element of it that is personal income, whereas disability support funding is not considered personal income. It's a non-taxable support that you get. So because the residential contracts are combined in that way, they can't be treated the same because there's elements of both of those, which is why there's a difference there. So an EGL personal budget, since EGL began, has been able to include some funding from the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Social Development later, but what that is your ORS funding, or ongoing resourcing scheme funding. So that money would usually go to your educational institution, your school, and that is used for your teacher aid time and your other specialist learning resources that you can pay for with that ORS funding. That becomes available to you once you've left school, and you may leave school at 21, you may leave school earlier. But if you leave school before you're 21, then that ORS funding can be put into your EGL personal budget along with the Ministry of Health Disability Support Services funding. And that is at a different rate of whether you're high or very high needs assessment of ORS level. But that just goes directly into your personal budget if you've left school, if that's the case. Similarly to that, if you are over 21 when you leave school, or if you have left school, received your Ministry of Education ORS, and then turn 21, at that point, it becomes the Ministry of Social Development, which provides some funding into your EGL personal budget. It's still linked to what your high or very high needs level of ORS funding was. So while it's not the same thing, the two are linked together. So the Ministry of Social Development calls that community participation funding. And it is a different rate to what the Ministry of Education had, because it is intended for different purposes. However, it works the same in that both either the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Social Development money is pulled in with your other Ministry of Health Disability Services, and it's a single budget that you can use for any of your disability support needs that you want. There's also a mention there of the transition funding. And so that is a single amount. It's where the rest of your budget funding amounts or assessed levels of support renew every year. The transition funding is a one-off amount that you receive, and it's meant to be in your last year of school. But if you are planning on an extended transition period, if you've got more than 1 year that you're going to be trying things to help you move away from school and into your post-school life, we can have that put into your budget earlier. It's not a massive amount. I think it's about 2,800 this financial year. But you can use that equally for anything that's transition, well, not necessarily specifically transition related, but that's the intent of it, is that it helps you help support your transition from school out of school. And if you haven't used it, because it is a single one-time allocation, if you haven't used it in that year, we can push to have that added back into your budget the next year if it's gone unused. We've had in the past some trouble with that, but we've been making sure that we can track that, and we've been pushing hosts to track that. So we'll move on to the next one.
Before you move on, Andrew, if I can interject one piece of information. So some of you might be aware of Project Search, held out of Burwood Hospital. If you have a young person who has been accepted into the Project Search internship, the fee to pay for that internship is their transition funds. So that would go straight into Project Search and would not be available for other purchases.
Well, we have been looking to simplify that so that it becomes, you're not wrong, it is your transition funding that would pay for Project Search. However, when I say we're simplifying that, we're looking to have that as billed to your personal budget through your funding host as any other things would. But yeah, you should know that project search takes up your transition funding largely. Yeah, cool. Thank you, Tara. So to get your personal budget, your EGL personal budget set up, it's not difficult. If you've had funding before, you likely will already have a host, and I will talk about the hosts later. I know I've mentioned that twice now without really talking much about them, but you will likely have had a budget of some kind before. When you are referred to EGL, once you have started working with us, you'll choose a connector, and they will then begin to start working with you on helping you create a good life plan. That may have already started to happen at your school as well, but it's just part of what our connectors are focused on helping you do. They can help you help support you to talk about your personal budgets and having that switched over from whatever your current funding looks like. And that is done through Lifelinks, who I mentioned before, who is the needs assessor and service coordinator. If you aren't comfortable talking to them, then the EGL connector can do that on your behalf. Or if you actually have a good relationship with them, then you're more than welcome to do that on your own as well. All they're going to need to know is that you have an EGL referral. They might check in with us, but largely that happens fairly simply. But depending on, again, it's such a personal matter of what support needs you have and what your funding does look like now or could look like with an EGL personal budget or a mixture of different support needs. It can be helpful to talk that through with a connector or with Lifelinks to assess what you would like to happen, what could change, what is already working for you maybe. Because in some cases, there is no need to change something that's already working. Where ultimately the point of an EGL personal budget is to give you more flexibility over how to use your funding. And if you're already comfortable with how you're using your funding, then there's no need to make more complexity, if that makes sense. So yeah, so now I'll talk about the hosts. When Lifelinks allocate a budget to you, a person, an individual, then the way that is arranged is through a host. So a host is an organization that has a flexible disability services contract. So they have the ability to manage your budget on your behalf. And so there is a handful that you can choose from. And again, connectors can be good at helping you pick a host that best fits you. Certain different hosts have different services they provide as well as hosting budgets. So some may provide support workers, some may run courses or classes, or some may have respite services. There's a mixture of what those different hosts offer. And so one may fit you better than the others. And like I say, connectors can help you do that. So in terms of hosting your budget without the other services, the way that they can do that is purchase things on your behalf or pay your support workers for you. And doing the payroll, whether they're an employee or a contractor, they can do it either way with that and help you work out some of those arrangements. They can pay for invoices on your behalf or reimburse you later, depending on the amount and what kind of host services they have. We've been working closely with hosts to allow for direct funding, which is simply paying a portion of your budget into an account that you can then use yourself, rather than having your host pay for everything through, first giving them the invoice, then them paying it, or first asking for a reimbursement, then having them process that one at a time. If you have ongoing payments that are similar, then it might be easier for you to know that you can receive that money directly, and then there's not an administrative stream of things that you are frequently doing. And then, as I mentioned, some of them provide their own services. So we'll move on. Yep. So I believe a common question is, what can you spend your money on? And we've been moving more and more away from traditional services of, only paying support workers to do things for you or on your behalf or helping you with things. From the start of EGR, we've been pushing and trying to recognize that there's many things that can look like disability supports, and in many cases that can be actually purchasing items or technology or courses or many things that are not actually paying a support worker to do things with you. And so what you can spend your money on is incredibly broad these days. It ultimately comes down to whether it relates to a disability cost and how that assists you. And so if it meets the purchasing guidelines, which I've sort of summed up as the 4 points there, the key one there being is a disability related cost. And whether that is or not is very individual specific. What is a disability related cost for one person may not be for another. So it's hard to answer that question for any given example without actually talking about the context of how it is assisting a person. For example, a person asking to have a TV or a screen or speakers or something might be very suitable for someone with vision or hearing impairments, but they might not be for someone with physical impairments. And those are very contextually dependent on that person's situation. So in many cases, it's quite easy to assess whether you can use your personal budget for it, because you can easily tell whether that's a disability related cost for that person or for you. The other considerations in the purchasing guidelines are, in my opinion, less important than that, but is sort of a secondary consideration. So is it a cost-effective option? Is less about finding the cheapest option or always having to push, down to make things cheaper. It's really about asking the question of, have you considered if there is another option that might be more suitable or might be more cost effective for you to use your funding on other things as well instead? And actually a really good example is, again, comparing that to a traditional form of paying support workers for, or, a lot of support needs. It actually might be more cost effective or cheaper to buy a piece of equipment that allows you to be independent and do that yourself, rather than pay someone else to constantly support you. And that cost effectiveness may actually be in the long term, whereas it's an expensive something up front, but in the long term, it's actually cheaper than just forever relying on a support worker. So there's ins and outs of some of those considerations. It's not straightforward sometimes, but in any one situation, it can be made very straightforward.
And I can provide a...
Yeah. Go on,
sorry, Andrew. I can provide some real life examples here, just to give an idea of how flexible it can become. So I work with a young lady who was born blind, and what she wanted was a way to stay fit and also something fun to do with her little brothers, because she's finding it difficult to they like to play video games. She cannot play video games. So what she asked for was a tandem electric bike. So then she would be able to exercise, stay fit, ride a bike, which without it being a tandem bike, she wouldn't be able to ride a bike, being completely blind. But then also you add this extra dynamic that her brothers can ride this bike with her. So it's good relationship building and normal life outcome. And all of it just kind of came together so nicely to be a great disability support for the family.
Mhm. Yeah, that was a really awesome example, actually. I do have a couple more which these pictures represent in the slides, but of course you're going to need the story behind it. The picture you see there is an example of where we had someone that had a fairly non-traditional purchase, which was they had an interest in doing laundry. It was one of their things. They just had a really keen interest in it. And they made a bit of an enterprise out of it, where purchasing a washing machine created a somewhat of an income stream for them, where they went to their local sports teams and did their laundry for them after the weekend and created a bit of a laundry service. And so where it can be difficult for people with disabilities to find mainstream employment in some cases, we also help support as an alternative to that, creating an income stream for yourself. And that's not something that would be traditionally funded by anything other than an EGL personal budget. So that's a really good example of how specifically an EGL personal budget is different from some of the traditional models of support and funding, that really meets all of the EGL principles. I know we haven't talked about those in this session, but Tara just touched on them before. Another example is the picture you see here is of a flat of guys that all met through school and are living with disability and had an EGL personal budget each. And of course, not everyone's funding looks the same, but as a very ordinary life outcome and a very mainstream thing is going flatting together. And so part of the flexibility of having an EGL personal budget was allowing them to pool some of their funding for sharing some supports, sharing some support worker time in some cases, and where it is traditionally a very individualized model of, this is your personal budget, this is your personal budget, allowing flexibility to split costs and allowing just flexibility in general meant that these four guys were able to live a much more independent, ordinary situation of flatting rather than actually being separated from their community and not being able to do that fairly typical thing of going flatting. So that's, that was another really cool example. I didn't quite touch much on the last of the purchase guidelines because it's a bit of the technical one, but ultimately it's about you shouldn't be spending your personal budget on things that are already funded by another system. Or so one of those is Enable or EMS services for specialist equipment. The reason I bring that up here is because as much as that is a restriction or exception to things that you can purchase, if there is a clear reason why that service is not suitable or has large drawbacks for you trying to wait to use that service or some element of that, then it can still be okay to use your personal budget for some of those things that kind of fall between the cracks of what services already exist or aren't funded. And so this example is similar to the one Tara suggested, was but of a tandem bike. The elements of being able to get out into the community with, in this case, I believe it is the father in this picture, but it's not the only person that can take someone out on a bike ride with them, and it helps people, well, this person in particular, get out and see the community more, get more fitness options, and allows them to feel like they're not waiting on someone else all the time, to be able to go out. And it's not something that would be funded by specialist equipment, so to speak, but nevertheless is a really good option. And that's why it got funded, because it's a really good example of meeting all of the EGL principles while creating something for this young person that they otherwise couldn't have under traditional models of support. And similarly, again, this young lady had difficulties to get out into the community. They struggled with public spaces with lots of people around, whereas the privacy of their home and backyard was a space that they liked to go outside in, and they really liked going outside, but struggled with lots of people around. And so creating a space in their own backyard that they were more comfortable in and allowed them to spend as much time as they liked outside comfortably was essentially an encouragement for them to go and do that, which is a much more healthy situation than being cramped up inside all the time, which had been the case a bit without having a more comfortable space outside. And it's that sort of creation that you can get from purchasing certain things that are, again, well outside of what would have been an old traditional model of support, but you can clearly see the benefits from it when you do spend it on these things. And so that's ultimately what it created for this young lady, is that she was enjoying her life so much more because she spent more time outside, and she was more comfortable with having people around and having some community connection because she could invite people around into her own safe space and things like that. So to go back a little bit on what I was talking about, the hosts, I mentioned there was a list of many. This is, I do believe, an exhaustive list. You'll notice that Manawanui at the top is separated from the others. This is because I mentioned the flexible disability services contracts. The list of all of those hosts below Manawanui have an FDS contract. However, Manawanui do not. They only have a contract for hosting budgets. So they do not provide any other services like support workers or courses or respite services or anything like those. They're purely an administrative host. So if that's what you're looking for, that can be quite useful for you. However, some of the other ones that have extra services may suit you more as well. And that's why I say who your host should be or is best for you may depend on what you're actually looking to get from your host. But for anyone that wasn't sure who any of them were, that is a list of those. And that's only a list of people that can host budgets. I believe several of them don't actually host budgets under that contract. They only provide disability services. So we have reached a point of questions. Does anyone have anything that they would like to ask?
Andrew, I'll just kick off with a quick question. If it is that you have met your connector and for whatever reason that relationship just doesn't seem to be gelling, is there an opportunity to switch to another connector within the Enabling Good Lives team?
Absolutely. The point of a connector is that they are an independent person that you trust and have a understanding of what your support needs and what your good life plan and everything is. If from the outset, you will choose the connector that you want to work with from the ones that we currently have available space with. But certainly, if you meet with your connector and you don't connect nicely, or you don't have that, I don't know, spark of a relationship with them, then by all means, you're welcome to say, actually, could we maybe try with a different connector? And they won't be offended with that. They know how important it is for people to feel comfortable with them.
And to add upon that as well, you can also switch your host if their services aren't working for the family. You can switch anytime. And you can also switch your LifeLinks coordinator anytime as well.
We've had a chat question come through. How does this process involve the school if the application is done through school? Or is it directly driven by home or whānau? I think by application, you mean a referral to EGL. It can happen either way. If your family or the individual can contact us directly and say, I'd like to have a referral to EGL, but in many cases, it does come through a school. A school will recognize people in their classes, hopefully, and say, oh, you have a disability support budget, you would be eligible to have an EGL personal budget and have a connector if that would suit you. So the schools often provide information about that and can help with the referral process, but it's not required. You can also do it on your own. It's either, and in fact, LifeLinks also can sometimes suggest that they, a person should be referred to EGL as well.
And what's the speed of that, Andrew? If it is that I've got my referral to Enabling Good Lives, how long do I have to wait in order to be connected to a connector? If that makes sense.
Often that can rely on how engaged you are with our referral process. So when we receive a referral, our connector support would follow up on that and push through the information about our connector selector tool and choosing a connector. So we really don't like to just push a connector on someone. We would prefer that you choose someone. And so that would be our first process, is to attempt to engage with the referred person and say, here is a list of our connectors available at the moment. Who do you think you would like to work with? And so it can depend on how quickly that engagement happens. But outside of that, if that happens really quickly, it can be as much as that week of the referral if the connector you've chosen has time, which can often be probably the bit there. But once someone's chosen a connector, they would be really pushing to try and meet you within the first few days of that happening, or at least week, usually, as long as possible. Yes, Tara.
Yes. Once you've selected your connector, then our connector support will send us an email saying that this family has contacted you, and then we strive to make contact with the families within 48 hours so that you'll receive a phone call from us or an email from us, and we'll start trying to organize a home visit as soon as convenient for the family and for the connector. So once you select your connector, it happens very quickly.
Thank you, Tara. So we have a question: how much are you supposed to put of your own money towards larger purchases through EGL? There's no direct answer to that, but I would say in many cases, none. If it is a disability support that you're purchasing, then your funding should cover the cost of the disability support. We've had certain situations where a purchase is augmenting an ordinary cost of life, in which case the difference might be what the disability element of what you're looking to buy is. But that, again, that's a very context dependent question. But in many cases, in most cases, if you're looking at buying a disability support, it should be entirely covered by the budget.
Yeah, and your connector will help you through the process, more of a like guiding and teaching process, so that you know, the first few we may work with you to request these purchases to a point where you feel comfortable to interact with your host and the EGL panel on your own. So the connector role is there to try and guide you through this not so easy to use system.
To maybe give an example to expand on what I meant by that with my answer is, for example, if you were permanently in a chair, but you could drive because you had mobility with your hands but not your feet, then it might be the ordinary cost that you get your own vehicle if you already have one, but the modifications to the vehicle would be a disability cost that's entirely funded, if that makes sense. But certainly in some cases, the entire vehicle can be funded as well.
In terms of preparing for your meeting with the connector, what would you encourage the disabled person or the family to think about to get the most from that first meeting with the connector?
I would say that's entirely up to you. Really, time shouldn't be in too much of a constraint for, you know, there's no limit to how long your connector can work with you. So you can go at your own pace. I wouldn't feel anxious about having to have preparation before you meet with your connector. They will be very understanding of where you're at, and part of their job is to, you know, help you navigate that space, even if you have no idea what you're looking for.
Anybody else got any other questions that they'd like to ask at all?
If I could, sorry about that. Just to add upon the last question of best way to utilize a visit, one of the biggest things we emphasize on is relationship building. So we want to get to know the young person specifically, but also the family, so that when opportunities come up, we know we have a good relationship where we can present those opportunities that we know would match up well with that young person and that family. So beginning early is our goal, so that we can grow our relationship and get to know each other really well and comfortable. And once we've established a good relationship, then I think the young person and the family are more comfortable with sharing what the goals are and what they want out of their life and their future. So Andrew's right, there's no limitation of how much you use us. Some people need us on a weekly basis, and some people ask a few questions and are on their way. It kind of just depends on what you need from us.
There's a question in the wee chat there, sorry, yep. Just who funds EGL?
So we are currently attached to the Ministry of Health. However, at some point with the going public of the new Ministry for Disabled People, with whatever the name that ministry ends up being called in the end, we will at some point next year, maybe in the future, becoming under that umbrella of the Ministry for Disabled People. So yeah, currently we are a unit within the Ministry of Health. And in case you were meaning who funds EGL personal budgets, that was, if you were to go back to the top of the presentation, then that's disability support services element is the Ministry of Health funding stream, which again in future may switch over to the new Ministry for Disabled People. But like I mentioned, there's the portions from the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Social Development that can pull into that budget. But for the simplicity of what your budget is actually coming from, that largely happens behind the scene, and the money flow comes from the Ministry of Health at the moment.
And we don't take anything out of your budget to use us. We're paid by the Ministry of Health. So we don't cost the family or the young person anything out of their budget.
No. Yeah, thanks, Tara. That's probably a really good point. Different from how the hosts may have some fees, or they will have fees for using their services. We are an independent function of the Ministry of Health that do not cost you anything from your budget.
Thank you. Has anybody else got any other questions at all? No, okay, if not, just want to thank you so much, Enabling Good Lives team, Andrew and Tara, for coming along and presenting today, but also to the families, the disabled people that are here today as well, to ask the questions and receive the information that they need.
Thank you for having us. If you do have any further questions, then you can send them through to either Julie and she'll forward them on to us, or you can email the email address there on screen, info@EGLives, or try and contact us in any way that you like. And if you're not already with a referral to EGL, then you can either contact us directly for that, or contact your school, or contact Lifelinks if you like. They can all help with getting you a referral.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest
Thank
of
you.
your day.